Today I'd like to talk to you about the Jungian theory of archetypes. The Jungian theory of archetypes was a theory developed by Carl Jung, and here he is. He was a student of Sigmund Freud. They had a falling out, and I'm not going to go into the details of how that happened, but he ended up developing his own theories of the unconscious, quite distinct from what Freud had come up with. And what he found, after considerable thought and study, was a thing called the collective unconscious. Now, there's no scientific proof that there is such a thing as a collective unconscious. It's simply a theory that organizes a lot of human behavior and a lot of aspects of human psychology into a single unitary whole. A lot of writers have interpreted Jung's theory as implying that there are gods and goddesses that are actually somehow resident in each of our minds' participation in the collective unconscious. So men are told that they are the repository for at least 4 archetypes. According to one author, these archetypes are king, warrior, magician, and lover. Other interpretations of Jung's idea have included heroes, as well as semi-divine beings that somehow come to the earth to save everyone. Heracles, sometimes called Hercules, was one of these. Jesus was one of these. The Buddha was one of these. And there are people who ask us to accept that we recognize them as heroic images because we have a template in our head that tells us when we're being heroic. At the same time, there are also female archetypes. And these include, most importantly, the mother, the maiden, the crone, and the healer. So we're asked to recognize that these archetypes live in each one of us and somehow guide our behavior. My answer to that is pretty simple. Charles Darwin. In fact, that's one of the reasons that this video is titled Archetypes, Carl Jung meets Charles Darwin. And that's because I want to offer a pretty simple hypothesis. If there is such a thing as a collective unconscious, and if there are such things as archetypes that are resident somehow, in any way at all, in the human psyche, they have to have come from our evolutionary history. Every aspect of humanity, every behavior, every trait, every habit, every survival strategy, all of them come from the need for our species to survive and to contribute to our evolution. If it doesn't help us survive, it's not going to be preserved. At least that's the way it was in our early evolutionary history. Nowadays, I'm afraid we preserve lots of things that are not really so good for our survival. Case in point. So, what's the advantage of having templates that help us recognize divinity and the various different shades of divinity? And the answer is pretty simple. They help us help other people. A lot of today's writers who deal with archetypes, they're telling us that the archetypes allow us to become who we're meant to be. So that when a woman has a baby, for example, the more she identifies with the mother archetype, the better a mother she'll be. Another one tells us that every woman needs to recognize the crone or the old wise woman so that she can own herself, identify herself with her wisdom, and somehow allow it to come out more fully. People who believe in archetypes tell us that all deities, all gods, and all goddesses correspond to the different archetypes. So that, for example, the Hindu god Ganesha is a hero, a sort of warrior type. And we find the same in the Greek god Ares, the Roman god Mars, the Yoruban deity called Ogun. The mother goddess, for example, is somehow identified with the moon. All of these are identified with different planets. And she is the same as Lakshmi in Hinduism, or Juno in Roman mythology, or Hera in Greek mythology. Then the old wise woman is said to correspond to Kali in Hinduism, to Hecate in Greece, Sekhmet in Egypt, and so forth. This part does make a lot of sense to me. If human beings have a kind of template telling them what the ideal human types are, it does give people something to live up to. But what's the evolutionary advantage in believing yourself to be like unto a god, or like unto a goddess? And the answer is that I don't believe there is any advantage there, and that compels me to come to a different interpretation of Jungian archetypes. Archetypes are not gods and goddesses that live within all of us. Archetypes are templates, recognition templates in our brains that allow us to see divinity and nobility and purity, sanctity and holiness in other people. Here's one of the best known archetypic images from the Western world: the Virgin Mary, also called the Blessed Mother. I actually like Blessed Mother better than Virgin Mary because I don't like the idea that women have to be virgins in order to achieve some sort of sanctity, and because what sanctifies the Blessed Mother is not that she's a virgin, it's that she is a mother. So if a mother were to think of herself and her infant and somehow see something divine or sacred in it, she will have thought about herself as a sacred being. And thinking of ourselves as deities, as heroes, as leaders, and so forth, has a way of breeding arrogance. And in our earliest evolutionary history, when we first appeared as a species, we lived according to tribal mores, tribal traditions, tribal rules. Of course, none of these rules were written down, none of them were codified into scriptures. People had an instinctive feeling for what was right and what was wrong. And when those instinctive feelings went off track, the people around them would guide them back onto the path that they needed to be on. Not so much a path as a way of relating to other people. Arrogance and self-importance are simply a bad idea in most tribal cultures. If a woman is overconfident in her wisdom and her ability to brew herbs and make medicines, she's liable to either let one of her patients fail, die, or she might actually kill them. What I think makes more sense is for individual people to grapple with low self-esteem, lack of confidence, uncertainty, and a lack of confidence that made them second-guess their own actions before they took them. Think over every action 3 times before they actually decide that it's a good idea and they should act on it. The carpenters have a saying, measure twice, cut once. Well, if you're confident in yourself as a deity, if you think that you're an instance of a god, you're very likely to make a mistake. Gods don't make a mistake, but you do. So if you're a young man and can be identified with the hero archetype, then you think of your actions 2 or 3 times. When you come back to your people, when you come back to your village, come back to your tribe with the food that you have hunted, and you throw down the antelope before all the people and help them to stay fed, help them to eat, then you're much more likely to be regarded as a hero. But if you take your own heroism for granted before you start hunting, or right while you're hunting, you're liable to be a little less careful. And instead of you impaling the antelope on your spear, you might just get impaled on their horns. So, what makes more sense to me for the Jungian theory of archetypes is to turn it on its head, at least compared to today's authors and contemporary psychologists who work with Jungian theories. Instead of seeing a goddess or a god in yourself, see them in other people. And then when we look at tribal society, that's largely what we find. We don't see people acting out the low self-esteem or the lack of confidence that makes them think their actions through several times before they act. What we do see is that the tribes treat people who have accomplished something as though they were temporarily gods, demigods, heroes, or what have you. So the woman has a child, and holding her newborn baby in her arms, she worries, will there be postpartum infections that could kill her? She'll wonder if she can take care of her baby well enough. Does she handle the child gently enough? Will her milk be enough? Will there be enough food in the village for her to stay fed so that she can continue to feed her baby? Lots of doubts appear, and every possible scenario for things going wrong will run through her head. So she's better off, and her child is better off, if she has some doubts. But that's not the way the tribe responds. The tribe celebrates the birth and treats the woman who has given birth, especially to her first child, as though she is a heroine. She has given the tribe another person, a girl who will grow up to have more babies, and the tribe shall flourish from the number of its population. Or she's given birth to a boy, and that boy could grow up to be a hunter who feeds his people. He could be a warrior who defends his people. And as a result, the tribe has a better chance of surviving, a better chance of staying together. So when people think of themselves as gods and goddesses, as heroes and heroines, as chiefs and wise people, as shaman, as old crone types, they get arrogant and they're prone to make mistakes. But when they're seen through the lens of the templates implied in the Jungian theory of archetypes, then those who do well for their tribes and do well for their people get rewarded more and encouraged to go out and repeat the same action. But think of what the action consisted of for the person who carried it out. If it was a hunter, yes, they may have thrown the spear that brought down the antelope when you're hunting. I've never been a hunter in the wild, so I can't really tell you too much about it. But when the people think of the action, they think of the hunter coming back with the meat, with the protein, and everyone sings their name. So-and-so is a great hunter. Look what he has brought. We will eat for 2 days because of this. Let all the women sing his name. Let all the men honor his spear. These kinds of recitations and songs are common in tribal cultures, where people who do good things are appreciated. But when the hunter remembers the same event, he will remember that once he went in and he didn't have a proper grip on his spear and he couldn't throw it. There are going to be lots of things that went through his mind. And for the hunter, those are part of the action. The people see the meat. The hunter remembers the planning, the foresight, the skill, the care and caution that went into his hunt that allowed him to come back not victorious but successful. And the people eat, the women sing his name, all the guys pat him on the back and say, well done. So that night everyone goes to bed on a full stomach. The people see him as a hero, so he doesn't need to see himself as a hero. He sees himself as an imperfect hunter who had an excellent chance of coming home with nothing. But his people don't see him that way. They see the skin of the antelope stretched out in a frame, ready to be made into some kind of clothing. They see the meat hanging over their fires. So I'm going to give you my brief summary of the Jungian theory of archetypes. Archetypes are not gods, goddesses, heroes, heroine, and wise people that live inside us. Archetypes are templates that allow us to see those beings, those entities, in other people. We sense the presence of the hero in the successful hunter. He doesn't sense it in himself. We sense the presence of the great mother goddess in the woman who has just given birth to a child. She doesn't see herself that way. She worries whether or not her child will grow up to adulthood. We don't see ourselves as the chief, the king of heaven, Zeus or Indra, when a man speaks in a tribal council and his words are regarded as wise. He wonders how he could have put it better. He wonders if he was really as convincing as he wanted to be. But in the end, standing up to speak, holding the talking stick in tribal council, he wonders if he did the best job they could. But the people were convinced by his argument. So they see him as a wise man. They see him as a potential chief. We don't see archetypes in ourselves because they don't exist in ourselves. The lens that allows us to look through the archetypes to see other people and see them as heroes, heroines, wise people, shaman, crones. That's a one-way mirror. We can see other people through those templates, but when we start using them to look at ourselves, we can become arrogant, and arrogant people make mistakes. And in our early evolutionary history, we couldn't afford that many mistakes. Someone who saw themselves as imbued with the power of a god or a goddess, an eternal spirit, anything like that. When we see ourselves as more or better than we actually are, in a tribal context, we threaten the life of the tribe. But when we see them in other people, we help the tribe to survive. So that's my summary of my interpretation of archetypes and the collective unconsciousness and Jungian psychology. If it hadn't been for the work of Carl Jung, I probably wouldn't have been able to arrive at this hypothesis. And yet, in terms of the most important theory for understanding human beings in science today, Darwin's theory of evolution, I certainly would not have been able to realize that tribal living means so much more than simply living together. It also means having the capacity to love one another so completely that the reality of the person is ignored for a time, and we see only what is best for them. And that means that the young woman who had a difficult birth, or the hunter who had a difficult hunt, are still motivated to go out and do it again. And if needs be, die in childbirth, or give their life as they try to take down another antelope to feed their people. We're evolved to get along with one another. We're evolved to be of service to one another. And the self-centered interpretation of the Jungian theory of archetypes, where we're encouraged to identify ourselves as gods or goddesses, doesn't help with that. So, the real message of the theory of archetypes for people in their day-to-day lives, I think, is as simple as this. Appreciate the people around you. See the best in them. Encourage them to repeat their good actions. Ultimately, we are evolved to love one another, to respect one another, and looking at them through the lens of the archetypes that exist in our minds, to admire them. Thank you.